This case was delayed for nearly 8 decades. It was never lost. It was unfinished. The facts existed early. The date of death was recorded. The unit was known. What did not exist were the tools, the processes, and the institutional capacity to complete the obligation. On the 15th of September, 2023, the Defense POW, an MIA accounting agency, formally identified the remains of Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens. Military records had already stated that he died on the 23rd of December 1944. For decades, he was confirmed dead but had no place on the ground. His mother had waited by the mailbox every afternoon for months after that first telegram. His father stopped talking about him entirely, not from lack of love, but because speaking the name out loud made the absence unbearable. His wife raised their daughter alone, never remarrying, keeping his photograph beside her bed until the day she died. This is not a story of discovery. It is a record of delayed responsibility. Henry Lee Stevens was born on the 31st of January 1921 in Monroe, Louisiana. Monroe in the 1930s was not a town that encouraged people to imagine elsewhere. It was a place built on repetition. Families remained close to where they started. Work followed established patterns. Men were measured not by what they dreamed of becoming, but by whether they fulfilled what was already expected of them. The Stevens household reflected that order. Henry's mother, Daisy R. Stevens, kept a spotless home. She rose before dawn and worked until the dishes from supper were dried and put away. She hummed while she worked old hymns, mostly the kind that didn't require words to carry meaning. When Henry was young, he'd sit at the kitchen table doing schoolwork while she prepared meals, and she'd say, "You keep your head down and do what's asked of you, Henry. That's how a man gets by." His father worked long hours in physically demanding labor and returned home exhausted. He was a man of few words, but on Sunday evenings, he'd sit on the porch with Henry and talk about practical things. How to fix an engine, how to read the weather, how to shake a man's hand so he knew you meant it. "You don't need to be the smartest or the strongest," his father once told him, watching the sun drop behind the tree line. "You just need to be the one people can count on." Nothing in the household suggested preparation for disruption. During the Depression years, caution became habit. Money was saved when possible. Purchases were delayed. Repairs were favored over replacement. These conditions shaped Henry's understanding of responsibility early. He learned that work came before preference, and that stability depended on compliance with routine. At school, Henry blended into the middle. His attendance was consistent. His grades were unremarkable. Teachers noted neither brilliance nor defiance. He completed tasks as instructed and moved on. In Monroe, this was not a failing. It was a mark of reliability. One teacher, Mrs. Brennan, wrote in his school record that Henry was steady, that he would do what was required without complaint. It was not praise exactly, but it was true. After leaving school, Henry entered the workforce without ceremony. The jobs available to him required physical effort and endurance rather than specialized training. He lifted materials, cleaned workspaces, assisted skilled laborers, and performed maintenance tasks. His supervisors described him as quiet and steady. No record suggests conflict or ambition. He did what was assigned and waited for the next instruction. His wages contributed directly to the household. His future, as far as it can be reconstructed, was local. Marriage, continued work, and care for family members fit within the expected path. He'd met a girl, Thelma Estelle, who worked at a shop in town. She had a quiet smile and didn't ask for much. They married young the way people did in those days. Not long after their daughter Daisy Marie was born, Henry would come home from work and hold the baby, while Thelma prepared supper, and for a brief time everything felt settled. "He's got your eyes," Thelma would say, watching him cradle their daughter. "She's got your smile," Henry would reply. They were building something small and ordinary. A life that didn't reach for grandeur, but aimed for stability. A home where the bills got paid, and the baby was fed, and love existed in the quiet rhythm of shared days. But before anything more could unfold, the world changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Within days, the United States was at war. When the draft notices came to Monroe, they came without drama. The shift was administrative. Registration dates were announced. Men reported as instructed. Trains departed on schedule. Families adapted their routines to absence rather than disruption. Henry registered for the draft and was inducted without delay. His physical examination recorded him as fit for service. Vision, hearing, and strength met requirements. There were no conditions that would restrict assignment. The morning he left, Daisy Stevens packed him a lunch he wouldn't eat. She pressed the package into his hands at the train station and said, "You write when you can." "You hear me, I will, Mama." His father shook his hand firm the way he'd taught him and said, "You do what they tell you. You keep your head down. You come back." Thelma held their infant daughter, barely 6 months old. She tried not to cry, but her voice broke when she spoke. "You come back to us," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come back." Henry touched his daughter's cheek, then pulled Thelma close. "I promise I'll try," he said. "I'll do everything I can." It was the last time they saw him. The train pulled away from Monroe on a cold morning in early 1942. Henry watched through the window as his family grew smaller, then disappeared. Around him, other young men sat in similar silence, carrying similar promises they hoped they could keep. The Army Air Forces at that time prioritized throughput. The goal was not refinement, but volume. Training programs were standardized and accelerated. Individual preferences carried little weight. Henry entered the system not as a volunteer for aviation, but as a resource assessed for assignment, based on aptitude tests and physical capabilities. Basic training stripped away civilian routines quickly. Days were governed by schedules set down to the minute. Movement followed commands. Personal judgment was replaced by compliance. Men learned that hesitation caused problems and initiative without authorization was discouraged. The system valued predictability above all else. In one of the few letters that survived, Henry wrote home in the spring of 1942, "Dear Mama and Thelma, they keep us busy here. Wake up before the sun. Drill until your legs don't feel like your own. I'm learning to handle equipment I never imagined. The sergeants are tough but fair. Don't worry about me. I'm doing fine. The food's not as good as yours, Mama, but it fills you up. Tell little Daisy her daddy thinks about her every day. I carry her picture in my pocket. Your son and husband, Henry." Daisy Stevens kept that letter in her Bible, pressed between the pages of Psalms. She would take it out sometimes late at night and read it by lamplight, touching the words he'd written as if she could feel him through the paper. Thelma kept her own letter separate in a drawer beside her bed. She'd read it to baby Daisy Marie before sleep. "That's from your daddy," she'd whisper. "He's far away right now, but he's thinking about us. He's coming home." Henry adapted to military life without difficulty. His records show no disciplinary actions. He passed physical requirements consistently. He followed procedures exactly as taught. This reliability made him suitable for specialized training without delay. After basic training, he was selected for technical school. The Army Air Forces needed flight engineers, men who could monitor complex aircraft systems, diagnose problems mid-flight, and serve as aerial gunners when necessary. The role combined mechanical aptitude with defensive capability. Training emphasized repetition and precision. Men practiced reading engine gauges until they could detect irregularities instantly. They learned fuel management systems, hydraulic operations, electrical systems. They memorized emergency procedures for every conceivable failure mode. They trained on defensive gunnery, learning to track targets while wearing heavy gloves in freezing conditions. Instructors drove home a single message, with relentless consistency. "You freeze up there, you die," Sergeant Kowalski would say every morning. "Your buddies die. The mission fails. You do it right every time or you don't do it at all. There are no second chances at 12,000 feet. Henry did it right every time. His training evaluations recorded him as proficient, reliable, and calm under pressure. He qualified in all required competencies and advanced on schedule. The aircraft central to his training was the Martin B-26 Marauder, a twin-engine medium bomber with a reputation for being unforgiving. Early models had killed so many pilots during training that crews called it the Widowmaker. But by the time Henry trained on it, the F model had improved wing characteristics that made it more stable. Still, the B-26 demanded respect. It had a high wing loading and fast landing speeds. Errors during takeoff or landing produced immediate consequences. But in the hands of a competent crew, it was fast, tough, and accurate. Henry learned to trust the aircraft. He learned where every gauge should read what every sound meant, how every system connected. He learned to work in the cramped crew compartment, moving between stations while wearing bulky flight gear. He learned to operate the top turret guns tracking hypothetical targets, while freezing wind screamed through the fuselage. By the spring of 1943, Henry had earned the rank of staff sergeant. The stripes meant he had technical authority and leadership responsibility within a crew. It also meant the Army considered him ready for combat. He was assigned to the 557 Bombardment Squadron, part of the 387 Bombardment Group, 9th Air Force. The 387 was known by their distinctive tiger stripe tail markings, bold yellow and black stripes that made their aircraft recognizable from a distance. The 9th Air Force specialized in tactical bombing. Unlike the 8th Air Force, which sent heavy bombers deep into Germany to destroy factories and cities, the 9th focused on targets close to the front lines. Rail yards, bridges, supply depots, troop concentrations. Their job was to support ground forces by cutting enemy supply lines and disrupting movement. These missions were shorter than strategic bombing runs, but no less dangerous. Tactical targets were heavily defended. Medium bombers flew at altitudes where anti-aircraft fire was most accurate. Losses were common. Replacement crews arrived regularly. Henry deployed to Europe in the summer of 1943. He wrote home when he could, though. The letters became less frequent as operations intensified. Dear Thelma, I can't tell you where I am, but I'm safe. The weather here is different than Louisiana. Everything is green. The people are kind when we see them. I fly with a good crew. The pilot is steady. We all look out for each other. I think about you and Daisy Marie every day. I wonder if she's walking yet. I wonder if she'll remember me when I get home. Kiss her for me. Tell her Daddy loves her. I'll write again when I can. All my love, Henry. Thelma carried that letter in her apron pocket until the paper wore soft at the creases. She would take it out during the day, reading it between chores, trying to imagine where he was and what he saw. Daisy Marie was walking by, then toddling around the house with uncertain steps. Thelma would point to Henry's photograph on the mantel and say, "That's your daddy." "Can you say Daddy?" The little girl would reach toward the photograph with chubby hands. "Dada," she'd say. "That's right," Thelma would whisper, lifting her daughter to touch the frame. "Daddy's coming home." By December of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical phase. Allied forces had liberated France and were pushing toward Germany's borders. Victory seemed within reach. But Hitler had one more desperate gamble. On the 16th of December 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. Exploiting bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft, they smashed through thinly held American lines, creating a bulge in the front that threatened to split the Allied armies. The weather was the key. Thick clouds and snowstorms prevented the overwhelming Allied air superiority from being brought to bear. For days, ground forces fought alone, while pilots sat grounded waiting for the skies to clear. By the 23rd of December, the weather finally began to improve. Gaps appeared in the cloud cover. The 9th Air Force received urgent orders to strike at German supply lines with maximum effort. Every available aircraft would fly. The 387 Bombardment Group was stationed at Clastres, France, designated as Airbase A-71. The base had been a German airfield until recently. The runways were scarred from combat and hasty repairs, but they were operational. On the morning of the 23rd, crews were briefed before dawn. The target was transportation infrastructure near Bitburg and Magen, Germany. Rail yards, marshalling areas, supply routes. Anything the Germans were using to feed men and materiel into the Ardennes offensive. Intelligence officers warned of heavy anti-aircraft defenses. The area was saturated with 88mm flak guns, the most lethal anti-aircraft weapon in the German arsenal. Crews would fly through concentrated fire to reach the target. Weather would be marginal. Cloud cover remained heavy in places. Visibility would be poor. But the mission was authorized. The situation on the ground at Bastogne was desperate. The surrounded 101st Airborne Division needed relief. Every German supply truck destroyed, every rail line cut, improved their chances of survival. Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens reported to his aircraft before sunrise. Serial number 42-96309. Tail code KSG. The nose art identified her as Shirley D., painted in white script with a cartoon figure beside it. The crew gathered near the aircraft for final checks. First Lieutenant George E. Stith, the pilot, was a steady officer from the Midwest. He'd flown dozens of missions and had a reputation for bringing his crew home. "Same as always," Stith told them, his breath misting in the cold air. "We go in, we hit the target, we come home. The flak will be thick, so stay sharp. Watch your stations. Follow procedures. We'll be fine." The crew consisted of 7 men. Second Lieutenant Ellis D. Sutter handled bombardier and navigator duties. First Lieutenant Lloyd L. Hawsley served as co-pilot and backup navigator. Staff Sergeant Hilbert G. Swanson operated the radio and manned one of the waist guns. Staff Sergeant Ephraim W. Jackson controlled the tail gun position guarding their rear. And Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens served as flight engineer and top turret gunner. They'd flown together before, not long enough to be a veteran crew, but long enough to know each other's rhythms. They trusted each other to do their jobs. Henry completed his pre-flight inspection methodically. Engine oil levels good. Hydraulic pressure normal. Fuel quantity confirmed. Ammunition loaded. Oxygen system checked. Everything ready. He climbed into the aircraft through the nose hatch and made his way to his station. The interior smelled of metal oil and the faint residue of previous missions. He settled into his position and began the internal checks, running through procedures so familiar they required no conscious thought. Around him, other aircraft of the 387 prepared for takeoff. Engines coughed to life, propellers spinning up with increasing roar. The sound built until individual engines merged into a single overwhelming thunder. Shirley D. rolled down the runway as the sky began to lighten. The tail came up. The wheels left the ground. They were airborne. Henry monitored his instruments as they climbed. Both engines ran smoothly. Manifold pressure normal. Cylinder head temperatures rising into the green. Oil pressure steady. Everything as it should be. The formation assembled over France, then turned east toward Germany. Henry shifted to his turret position, scanning the sky through the clear dome, looking for enemy fighters that might dive out of the clouds. Watching the other aircraft in formation, maintaining visual contact. Below them, the landscape of war unrolled. Towns reduced to rubble. Roads cratered by bombs. The scars of battle etched into earth and stone. As they crossed into German-held territory, the defensive fire began. Black puffs appeared in the sky, flak bursts from anti-aircraft batteries. The Germans were tracking their formation, calculating altitude and speed, firing to saturate the airspace they would pass through. The flak was distant at first. The bursts appeared off to the side or above them, dark flowers blooming and fading against the gray sky. But as they approached the target area, the fire intensified. Flak bursts appeared at their altitude, close enough to hear the sharp crack of detonation over the engine noise. Close enough to feel the aircraft shudder when fragments passed nearby. Henry scanned his sector hands on the gun controls, ready to engage if fighters appeared. The flak was the gunner's job on the ground. His job was aircraft that might attack. The formation flew straight and level on the bomb run. No evasive maneuvers now. The bombardier needed a stable platform to aim. Every crew member knew these were the most dangerous seconds of every mission, when they had to hold course while guns below fired with calculated precision. "Bombs away," Sutter's voice came through the intercom. The aircraft lifted slightly as the bomb load released. Below, explosions walked across the rail yards. Secondary detonations showed direct hits on ammunition or fuel storage. Then, as Shirley D began its turn away from the target, everything changed. A flak burst detonated close enough that the aircraft lurched violently. Metal fragments ripped through the right wing. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800 engine shuddered and began to fail. Henry saw it on his instruments instantly. Oil pressure dropping rapidly. Cylinder head temperature spiking. The engine was dying. Then flame appeared along the right wing. Not the clean blue of exhaust, but the angry orange of fuel fire. It spread quickly, fed by ruptured lines and damaged tanks. Where hit, Stith's voice came through the intercom, calm but urgent. "Right engine's on fire. Feather number 2. Prepare to bail out." Henry's hands moved through shutdown procedures. Fuel cut off to the damaged engine. Fire suppression system activated. But the fire continued to burn. The wing structure was already compromised. The aircraft began to lose altitude. One engine couldn't maintain formation. Smoke poured into the fuselage through gaps and vents. The temperature inside rose as flames ate through metal. Other aircraft in formation pulled away, maintaining spacing. They couldn't help, they could only watch. Stith fought the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level, trying to give his crew time to escape. His voice came through the intercom again, louder, now cutting through the chaos. "Bail out. Bail out. Bail out." The command was unmistakable. The crew moved to emergency procedures drilled into them through countless training sessions. Disconnect oxygen. Release harness. Move to exit points. Jump. In the nose, Sutter and Hawsley scrambled for the forward hatch. They got it open, felt the blast of freezing wind, and jumped into space. Their parachutes deployed. They drifted down toward Belgian countryside. In the waist, Swanson fought his way to the door. He tumbled out and pulled his ripcord. The canopy blossomed above him. At the tail, Jackson squeezed through his narrow exit. He fell clear and deployed his chute. All 4 men would land behind German lines. All 4 would spend the rest of the war as prisoners. But all 4 would survive. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Stith remained at the controls. The aircraft was rolling now, losing altitude fast. But he held it together, fighting to give his men every second he could. And somewhere in the burning aircraft, Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens did not make it out. The records offer no clarity about his final moments. No witness saw what happened. The possibilities are listed in official reports with clinical detachment. He may have been injured by the initial flak impact. He may have been overcome by smoke before reaching an exit. He may have been trapped by fire or structural damage. Equipment may have failed. The documentation records only that he did not exit the aircraft. Shirley D continued its descent, trailing fire and smoke. It crashed in the countryside near the Belgian village of Winville in an area known as Haumont. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated. Fire consumed what remained. Other bombers in the formation saw it go down. They noted the location in their reports. Then they continued toward home. There was nothing else they could do. On the ground, Belgian civilians heard the crash. Marcel Dufour, a farmer who lived near Winville, told investigators years later what he remembered. "We heard the plane coming down. The engine sound was wrong, struggling. Then we heard it hit. The explosion. Fire rose above the trees. We wanted to help, but the area was not safe. Germans were still near. We could only watch and pray for the souls aboard." The American Graves Registration Service would eventually reach the site, but not immediately. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging. Bastogne remained surrounded. Combat operations took priority over recovery. When AGRS personnel finally arrived weeks later, they found wreckage scattered across frozen ground. Fire had destroyed much of the structure. What remained was tangled metal, burned components, and the grim evidence of violent death. They recovered human remains from the site. They found Lieutenant George Stith and were able to identify him through dental records. He was buried with military honors. But other remains found at the crash site could not be identified with the tools available in 1945. Dental records required intact teeth. Physical identification required recognizable features. Fire and impact had destroyed both. Some remains were classified as unknown and buried accordingly. Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens was not among those identified. His status was listed as missing in action. On the 26th of December 1944, 72 hours after the crash, the official determination was made. With 4 crew members confirmed as prisoners of war, 1 confirmed dead and buried, and Henry Stevens unaccounted for, his case was classified as non-recoverable. The notification arrived at the Stevens home in Monroe, Louisiana, in the first week of January 1945. Daisy Stevens was preparing supper when she heard the knock at the door. Western Union. The telegram delivery boy stood on the porch, holding the envelope no one wanted to receive. She dried her hands on her apron and took it. Her hands shook as she opened it. The telegram stated that the Secretary of War desired to express his deep regret that Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens had been reported missing in action on the 23rd of December over Belgium. Daisy Stevens read it 3 times. Then, she sat down at the kitchen table and placed her hands flat on the surface, as if steadying herself against a force that might carry her away. Her husband came in from work an hour later. She showed him the telegram without speaking. He read it, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. He walked back outside and sat on the porch steps. He didn't come inside until long after dark. Thelma received her own notification the same day. She was at home with Daisy Marie, now 3 years old. When she read the telegram, she couldn't breathe for several seconds. Missing didn't mean dead. Missing meant they didn't know. Missing meant hope, however thin. She gathered up her daughter and walked to Daisy Stevens's house. The 2 women sat together in silence while little Daisy Marie played on the floor, unaware that the world had changed. "He's not dead," Thelma finally said. "Missing doesn't mean dead." "We don't know, child," Daisy Stevens replied quietly, her voice hollow. "We just don't know anything at all." More letters arrived over the following weeks. Official correspondence explaining what was known. The aircraft had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. It had crashed near Winville, Belgium. Some crew members had survived and were prisoners. Some had not. Sergeant Stevens had not been recovered. Every effort was being made. The language was precise and careful. It acknowledged death without confirming burial. It expressed regret without offering resolution. By 1946, after months without additional information, the Army Air Forces made a final determination. Based on the circumstances, the passage of time, and the absence of any contrary evidence, Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens was officially declared. Killed in action, died on the 23rd of December 1944. His death was now certain in the official record. His burial location was not. His name was engraved on the wall of the missing at the Ardennes American Cemetery in Belgium. The wall existed specifically for this purpose, to acknowledge those who had died, but whose remains could not be recovered or identified. For the Stevens family, this created an impossible contradiction. The government stated with certainty that Henry was dead. It could not state where he lay. There was no grave to visit, no ground to stand on, no place to bring flowers or speak his name. Daisy Stevens never traveled to Belgium to see the wall. She wanted to. She talked about it sometimes, imagining what it would be like to stand before her son's name carved in stone thousands of miles from home. But she never made the trip. Money was tight. The journey seemed impossibly far. And what would she be visiting? A name on a wall, not her son. She died in 1962, 17 years after that first telegram. She was buried in Monroe in the cemetery where her own parents lay. Her husband chose the headstone inscription himself. Mother of Henry Lee Stevens, it read beneath her name. Waiting. Thelma raised Daisy Marie alone. People in town encouraged her to move on to consider remarrying. She was young. Her daughter needed a father. Life had to continue. But she couldn't. Henry was her husband. Somewhere out there in ground she'd never seen, he was waiting. How could she give up on him? She kept his photograph on the dresser in her bedroom. Every night before sleep, she'd look at it and say goodnight. Every morning, she'd say good morning. As if he could hear. As if the distance between them was measured in rooms rather than years in an ocean. She told Daisy Marie stories about her father. Your daddy was a good man. He worked hard every day. He loved us more than anything. He went away to fight in the war so we could be safe. And one day, maybe they'll find him and bring him home. Daisy Marie grew up with her father as a ghost, present in photographs and stories, but absent from every moment that mattered. She had no memory of him. She'd been too young when he left. But she carried his absence like a weight she'd inherited. Thelma died in the 1980s. She was buried beside her parents, still using her married name, Stevens. Still waiting for a husband who'd been gone for 40 years. Daisy Marie inherited that waiting. She married and had her own son, Garrett. She told him about the grandfather he'd never meet. Your grandfather was a hero, she'd tell Garrett. He served his country in the war. He died in Belgium. But they never found him. He's still out there somewhere. The waiting became generational. It passed from Daisy Stevens to Thelma to Daisy Marie. Each generation carrying the knowledge of absence. Each generation hoping someone someday would finish what should have been finished in 1944. For decades, nothing changed. Henry's file remained in military archives. His name remained on the wall in Belgium. His case was considered closed. The determination had been made. Non-recoverable. Technology advanced. Forensic science developed new capabilities. DNA analysis emerged as a tool so powerful, it could identify remains from fragments of bone. But these advances were not applied to World War II cases. The war was too far in the past. The remains too degraded. The families too dispersed. The assumption persisted that nothing more could be done. But assumptions change when capability changes. In the early 2010s, the institutional framework surrounding unresolved losses shifted. The Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency was established, consolidating various recovery efforts under a single command. Its mandate included not just recent conflicts but historical cases from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. New leadership brought new priorities. The agency committed to reassessing cases previously labeled non-recoverable. Advances in archaeology, genealogy, and DNA analysis meant that assumptions made in 1945 no longer held. If crash sites could be precisely located, if archaeological techniques could recover fragments previous generations missed, if DNA could identify remains from samples smaller than anyone imagined possible, then perhaps some of the missing could still come home. In 2013, WWII analysts began reviewing crash sites in Belgium from the Battle of the Bulge. The Shirley D crash near Winville was flagged as a viable candidate. The location was documented in wartime reports. Partial crew recovery had been completed in 1945. The site had not been disturbed by major development. Archaeological excavation might yield additional remains. The review moved slowly. Archives had to be searched, maps compared, land ownership researched, local authorities contacted. Each step took months. The breakthrough came from a partnership between WWII and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Missing in Action Recovery and Identification Project. This collaboration brought academic archaeological expertise to military recovery efforts. The Wisconsin team specialized in battlefield archaeology. They'd worked on World War II sites across Europe, developing techniques for recovering remains from aircraft crashes, mass graves, and battle sites where conventional recovery had failed. In 2019, Professor Greg Jameson led a combined WWII Wisconsin team to Winville. The team included military personnel, civilian archaeologists, and volunteers. One volunteer, Michael McLaren, was a retired Army veteran who worked for the Defense Health Agency. When asked why he'd taken vacation time to dig in Belgian mud for fragments of bone, he said simply, "It's another way to serve." These men didn't come home. The least we can do is try to bring them back. The excavation began in early summer. The team established a grid over the suspected impact site. They used ground-penetrating radar to identify anomalies in the soil. They opened test pits, methodically screening every shovelful of dirt through fine mesh. The work was slow, backbreaking, often discouraging. Days passed, finding nothing but soil and stones. Then they began finding pieces of Shirley D, twisted aluminum fragments, burned engine components, pieces of equipment bearing serial numbers that matched the crashed aircraft. They were in the right place. Jameson gathered his team each morning before work began. "Every piece matters," he'd tell them. "We're not just looking for remains. We're looking for anything that tells this man's story. An identification tag, a button, eyeglasses, anything. And we're doing this because it matters. Because somewhere there's a family that's been waiting 75 years. Because we promised to bring them all home, and promises don't have expiration dates." The team found a pair of eyeglasses 3 feet underground. The frames were twisted and corroded but intact. Someone had worn these. Someone who'd needed help, seeing who'd put them on every morning, who'd had them on when the aircraft hit the ground. Then they found bone. Small fragments, charred, scattered across the excavation site. Each piece carefully exposed, documented, photographed, and placed before recovery. Each piece treated with absolute reverence. They didn't know whose bone they'd found. Not yet. But they knew it was human. They knew it was from 1944. They knew it deserved every measure of respect and care. The excavation continued for weeks. Every fragment of bone was recovered. The soil was screened multiple times. Nothing was overlooked. When the fieldwork concluded, the remains were transported to WWII laboratories in Hawaii for analysis. The fragments were examined by forensic anthropologists to confirm they were human and consistent with the historical record. Once confirmed, the remains were sent to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System for DNA analysis. Dr. Michael Torres led the DNA work. He'd spent 15 years identifying remains from past conflicts. Most cases didn't end in identification. The DNA was too degraded. The reference samples didn't exist. The science hit its limits. But every case deserved the full effort. Every fragment of bone represented a person who'd served and not come home. Every case was someone's family still waiting. Looking at the Stevens case file, Torres told his team, "This man has been waiting since 1944. His family has been waiting just as long. We're going to do everything we can." DNA extraction from 80-year-old bone is extraordinarily difficult. Heat, moisture, soil chemistry, and time degrade genetic material. Success is never guaranteed. The team attempted mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces the maternal line and survives degradation better than nuclear DNA. They also attempted autosomal STR testing, where sufficient DNA was present. Parallel to laboratory work, WWII genealogists traced Henry's family line. They needed reference DNA from living relatives. The genealogists found that Henry's mother, Daisy R. Stevens, had passed away in 1962. His wife, Thelma, had died in the 1980s. But his daughter, Daisy Marie Franklin, was still alive. She was 78 years old, living in Bunnell, Florida. She'd spent her entire life knowing her father only through photographs and her mother's stories. When WWII contacted her, the call was handled with great care. The genealogist introduced herself, explained the recovery effort, and asked if Daisy Marie would be willing to provide a DNA reference sample. Daisy Marie was silent for several seconds after hearing the request. "My whole life," she finally said, her voice breaking. "My whole life we've wondered where he was. My mother died not knowing. My grandmother died not knowing. They waited and waited and never got an answer. And now maybe we can finally bring him home." "Yes, ma'am," the genealogist replied gently. "That's what we're trying to do." Daisy Marie provided a DNA sample. So did her son Garrett. The samples were processed and entered into the comparison database. Then came months of waiting. DNA analysis proceeds on its own timeline. There are no shortcuts. In the summer of 2023, the match came through. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from bone fragments recovered at Winville was consistent with the Stevens maternal line. Autosomal STR testing provided additional confirmation. The statistical confidence exceeded identification thresholds. Independent laboratories verified the results. Anthropological analysis confirmed consistency with historical records. Genealogical research confirmed the family connection. Dr. Torres made the call to Daisy Marie himself. He'd made hundreds of these calls. They never got easier. But this one carried the weight of 79 years. "Mrs. Franklin, this is Dr. Michael Torres from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. I'm calling with news about your father." He paused, letting her prepare. "We have confirmed identification. Your father, Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens, has been accounted for. We're bringing him home." Daisy Marie cried. She cried for the father she never knew, for the mother who'd waited a lifetime, for the grandmother who'd set an extra place at the table every Sunday, for a son who never came home. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on him. Thank you for not forgetting." On the 15th of September 2023, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency officially announced the identification of Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens. The press release was formal, technical. It listed dates, units, methods. It acknowledged the partnership with the University of Wisconsin. It thanked all who contributed. But for Daisy Marie Franklin, it meant her father finally had his name back. After 79 years listed as non-recoverable, Henry Lee Stevens was accounted for. Arrangements began immediately. Daisy Marie was offered decisions that had never existed before. Where should her father be laid to rest? What honors should accompany his burial? She chose Florida National Cemetery in Bushnell, near where she lived. After nearly 8 decades, she wanted her father close. She wanted to be able to visit him, to finally have ground where she could stand and speak to him. The burial was scheduled for the 8th of March, 2024. The day arrived clear and warm, typical Florida spring weather. The cemetery grounds were immaculate rows of white headstones, extending across manicured grass. A hearse arrived, carrying a flag-draped casket. Inside were the recovered remains of Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens, returned to American soil for the first time since 1942. An honor guard stood at attention, active duty soldiers in dress uniforms representing the army he'd served. They moved with precise ceremony, carrying the casket to the gravesite. Daisy Marie Franklin sat in the front row. She was 79 years old now, the same age her father would have been when she was born. Her son Garrett sat beside her. Other family members filled the remaining chairs. Descendants of people who'd waited and died without knowing. A chaplain spoke about service, sacrifice, and the nation's debt to those who answered the call. He spoke about promises kept, even when kept late. He spoke about a young man from Louisiana who'd done his duty and paid the ultimate price. Then the honor guard performed their ritual. Rifles raised. 3 volleys fired in perfect synchronization, the sharp cracks echoing across the cemetery. A bugler played taps 24 notes that carried the weight of military grief. The flag was folded with absolute precision, 13 folds, each with symbolic meaning, until it formed a tight triangle of stars against blue. The officer in charge, a young captain not yet born when Henry died, approached Daisy Marie. He knelt before her and spoke words unchanged for generations. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service. Daisy Marie took the flag in her arms and held it against her chest. She thought about her mother, Thelma, who'd slept alone for 40 years, waiting for this moment. She thought about her grandmother, Daisy, who'd set an extra place at Sunday dinner until the day she died. "He's home," she whispered. "Mama, Grandma, he's finally home." The casket was lowered into the ground. Daisy Marie stood and approached the grave. She knelt at the edge and placed her hand on the earth. "I'm sorry it took so long, Daddy," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. Mama didn't get to see this. I'm sorry Grandma didn't get to see this. But you're home now. Finally you're home." In Belgium, at the Ardennes American Cemetery, workers carefully removed Henry's name from the wall of the missing. In its place, they affixed a small rosette, a bronze flower, that indicates remains once missing have been recovered and identified. The rosette is subtle. Most visitors walk past without noticing, but those who know what to look for see it as a promise fulfilled. Within DPAA records, Henry's case file was officially closed. The file now contained his complete story: birth records, enlistment papers, training evaluations, mission reports, casualty notifications, 79 years of waiting, archaeological excavation reports, DNA analysis results, family correspondence, burial records. The completeness of the file stood in sharp contrast to the decades when it had consisted almost entirely of words like missing, unknown, and non-recoverable. Daisy Marie visits her father's grave regularly. She brings flowers. She sits on the bench nearby and talks to him, telling him about the life he missed. "You have a grandson, Daddy. His name is Garrett. He's a good man. He has your steady way about him. You would have been proud of him. You would have been proud of me too, I think. Mama raised me right. She never let me forget you." She pauses, looking at the white marble headstone with its clean engraving. Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens, United States Army Air Forces, World War II. January 31, 1921 to December 23, 1944. Identified September 15, 2023. That last line is what matters most. Not the death date, which was always known, but the identification date. The proof that even 79 years later the promise was kept. "It took too long, Daddy," she says. "Mama waited her whole life. Grandma waited her whole life. They died not knowing where you were. That's what 79 years cost. But you're home now. We found you. We brought you home." Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens was not lost to history. He was lost to time. The record is complete now. Birth, service, death, recovery, burial. The system eventually finished what it began. But what was restored is incomplete. Henry came home. His identity was confirmed. His service was honored. His daughter finally has ground to stand on. What was never restored were the years. The decades Daisy Stevens spent hoping her son might somehow still be alive. The lifetime Thelma spent raising a daughter alone, keeping a photograph beside her bed, refusing to move on because moving on meant giving up. The childhood Daisy Marie spent without a father knowing him, only through stories that grew thinner with each telling. 79 years. That span is the central fact of this case. The work accomplished between 2013 and 2024 was remarkable. It required dedication, expertise, and technology that didn't exist in 1944. It proved that promises can be kept even across generations, but it also proves the cost of delay. Every year that passed was another year the people who loved Henry lived with absence. Every year was another year of questions without answers, grief without closure, waiting without end. The system did not forget Henry Lee Stevens. His name remained in files. His case was documented. The obligation was acknowledged. But the system could not reach him, not in 1945 when his mother still hoped every day for news. Not in 1960 when his wife still waited beside an empty place at the table. Not in 1980, when his daughter still wondered where her father lay. Only in 2023, when everyone who'd loved him most was already gone. That is the cost that cannot be recovered. not through archaeology or DNA analysis or military ceremony. Time once lost stays lost. The record is complete now. Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens has been accounted for. The waiting is over. But for those who waited longest, for those who died before he came home, there was no completion. Only absence carried to the grave. This is what delayed responsibility looks like. Not through negligence, but through limitation. Not through forgetting, but through the slow accumulation of years, while capability caught up to obligation. A nation can remember accurately and still arrive late. The distinction matters. The cost remains. The lesson endures. Staff Sergeant Henry Lee Stevens is home. His family can visit him. His name marks actual ground instead of just a wall of memory. But the people who needed this most never saw it happen. That is the price of 79 years. That is what delay costs. That is what cannot be restored. The waiting is over. The cost remains.